Hello, for this week's class, we're doing HDR photography. This is a little bit more technical and complex, and I wanted to make sure that I went over all the details with you myself. So for HDR photography, the first thing you have to understand is that what we're doing is we're going to be bracketing our photographs. In order to understand what bracketing is, you have to understand the way that stops work in relationship to shutter speed, f-stops, and ISO. So your camera is more than likely, if you look at this chart, will have stops that run from whole to thirds. A whole stop is the progression in the darker numbers on these charts here. So again, when we're looking at shutter speeds, when we go from a quarter of a second to a half second to 1 second, that's a full stop. When you're looking at f-stops, when you go from 1.4 to 2 to 2.8 to 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22, those are full stops. Now again, most of your cameras are going to have these thirds of stops. Some of them may even have quarter stops. The smaller numbers are going to be determined by your lenses. So many of you might not have these smaller numbers here. You might start out with 4 or even 5.6 depending on your lens. In order to bracket your photographs, you're going to take a series of pictures starting with the correct exposure and then moving to 1 plus minus 1. You can also do plus and minus 2 or 3. It depends on how you'd like to approach it. So here you see a series of photographs of the same subject, all taken from a fixed angle, each at a different exposure interval. So here we're going from 1/25th to 1/60th to 1/30th to 1/15th to 1/8th. Again, going back to the chart, what you see there is again 1, 2, boom, straight through progression of full stop intervals. What you should also notice in the metadata is that these images are each shot at the same f-stop as well as the same ISO. What this does is it creates a consistent depth of field and consistent grain in relationship to the overall quality of your images. The objective of HDR photography is to work with high dynamic range. That's what HDR stands for. When you look at this particular photograph of this glass object with such a strong sunlight coming from the left, you can see the way that areas are very overexposed. As the exposure moves up, we get to the camera's appropriate range. What we see is we still have an overexposure and again some loss of detail in relationship to the way the glass reflects light. In order to prevent that loss, we need to go all the way to this exposure, and now we can see all of the details are preserved in the mosaic of the glass object. Whereas the lower exposures, the faster exposures, the longer exposures, we've lost a great deal of that information. But when we look at the overall picture here, while the detail has been preserved in the highlights, the darks are in fact too dark. So this balance didn't work terribly well in that sense. So here, in this range, again, we can see nice details in our darks. Shadows are clear, a lot of nice detail on the table. But again, in order to look at all the detail in the mosaic area, the highlights, the darks get too dark. So what HDR is about is trying to balance this out by combining these photos together. So if we look at a quick example, this is Canon's camera simulator. You just go and type in camera simulator, Canon camera simulator, and it'll take you here on Google. So what I'm talking about here in relationship to your bracketing can be found right here in the use of your light meter. Now this is based off of a Canon camera. However, a Nikon or any DSLR should have a similar light meter as what you see here. Now in this particular setup, we have a photograph we can take. We have control of our aperture, shutter speed, and our ISO. Again, we're going to keep our aperture as a fixed number because we do not want to change the effect of the depth of field in the series of photographs that we take. So make that decision based on the given situation. Now again, this particular light setup is not a very good example for HDR, so I'm really just using this as simulator in order to show you how bracketing works. The main thing about going back to the photographic examples that I have here is you need extreme contrast of light. If you're photographing outdoors on a gray day where you don't have a strong enough light source, you're going to be able to create an even exposure, and you will not have highlights blown out as you see in this particular example. So you need a strong contrasting light situation, or again, it is not going to work. So when you look at your light meter, what you see is the current setup here is at a +1. So I'm going to move my shutter speed until I get that aligned with 0. And this is how you should be achieving all of your standard exposures to always create the correct exposure according to the camera. So in this particular situation, again, I would recommend a lower ISO setting, but I'm just going to leave it for this demonstration purpose. So when I take that particular photograph, we have our correct exposure. Now, our next step is going to be to meter to a -1 and a +1. You'll see that you have intervals in between here. And again, if we reference back to this chart, what those intervals in between are either thirds of stops or quarter stops, again, depending on your camera. In this case, they are thirds of stops. So, again, what we need now is to do a -1 shot. Okay, so then we're going to go back again, and now we need to do the other way, and we need a +1 shot. Now what this is giving us is 3 different photographs of the same subject matter with 3 different exposures. You need a minimum of 3 for this to work properly. Again, the example I'm showing you can be done with 5. So this is a basic technique referred to as bracketing. Bracketing can be used beyond HDR just to try to get the correct exposure under a given light situation. You may often find, for example, that your shadows are too dark in a certain situation, and by using a bracketing approach, you can therefore get the correct exposure even though your camera thought it had the right one. The camera is not always going to be correct. But for HDR, again, we need to use the minimum 3 exposures. So the next step then is going to be to load those pictures into the computer. For this, I would recommend using Bridge. If you look here, I'm using Adobe Bridge. This can also be done, however, directly through Photoshop. So I've got my 5 photographs that I'm going to use. Instead of a 3-step interval, I'm approaching this with a 5-step interval. So I'm just going to select all 5 images and go to Tools. Under Tools, I'm going to go to Photoshop. Under Photoshop, we are now going to merge to HDR Pro. Often gives that message, and then we'll just kick it into Photoshop. And now you'll see that the program is taking over for us at this point. You can see all 5 layers on the right-hand side, and it is processing those together as a combination. So now we have all 5 pictures combined together. You can see the different levels here, plus 1.9, plus 1, even, minus 1, minus 2. And it has gone ahead and it's combined those images together for us without any real problem here. Now again, this needs to be done with a fixed viewpoint using a tripod. If you don't use a tripod, you're going to potentially see overlapping. Because again, the pictures are literally being laid on top of one another and then combined into a single image. If you look on the right-hand side, in the HDR Pro editor, you do have some ability to make some additional changes. One thing is if you have a ghosting effect from overlapping, there is remove ghost. Again, this one was shot particularly well, and I'm not needing to do that. As you see, when I click that, I don't see any actual changes. If you're shooting outdoors, and it's a very, very bright sunny day and you have trees moving due to wind, that could create a ghosting effect. So in that particular situation, the remove ghosts could be useful. Edge glow and the strength of that edge smoothness could also potentially improve your images. So you want to preserve smoothing while boosting detail. Could also work well if in fact you have any movement in your objects. This particular setup was done with a strong sunlight coming from the window, hitting the glass, and then projecting the light dots onto the wall in the back from the reflection on the mosaic itself. This type of a shot will work well, and that's why I chose to use this one in relationship to a demonstration purpose. So an indoor shot can work well as long as you have a strong light source. Again, what's most important to remember here is that this is not going to work well with an even amount of light. So a cloudy day is not a good HDR day. So I'm just going to click OK, and Photoshop is going to continue to process the merge to HDR, and it will then create us an image with a singular layer, and essentially we are ready to go here. So the next thing you could do is some minor editing adjustments if you'd like, if you want to manipulate your color, contrast, anything a little bit. But again, the objective of the project is to preserve the highlights as well as the shadows so that the entire image is evenly red. So don't push it so far that any of that is changed. So that is how to make an HDR photograph. So anyone has any questions or concerns about how to approach the project, just reach out and contact me. Okay, thanks, and next week's spring break, so have a good week off.